Alan Peterson here with Meet the Thriller Author, and today I'm happy to have on Zoom Lydia Kang. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So I want to thank you for being on the podcast, and you have such an interesting background. So you're a physician, and now you're writing best-selling novels. How did that happen?
It was a little bit of a windy road. I guess I kind of started about 10 years. So I was about 8 or 9 years into my medical career, and I joined a writing group with a bunch of other doctors, and we started writing poetry and fiction and nonfiction. And I just kind of took a huge leap of faith after doing this for about a year or two, and just decided to try writing novels. Like, I kind of can't believe I actually did that. But it's amazing how supportive the writing community is. Like, really, people are really great about trying to lift each other up and support each other when you're doing something scary and creative. And so I just sort of went with that energy, and I gave it a try. And that's how it started.
Yeah, it is a great writing community. I'm always amazed about that too. Even like if you're quote unquote competitors, everyone still helps you out, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
awesome.
I mean, I learned so much from everybody, and I learned that you didn't really need to have to go through, like, you didn't necessarily need to go to graduate school for 4 years and get another degree to even start. You could just dive in, and so that's kind of, it started a little bit of a roundabout way, but yeah.
Yeah, probably a lot easier than going through medical school.
You know what? It was, but it wasn't in other ways, because, like, the funny thing about medical school is that it's very straightforward. Like, if you want to become a doctor, it's a very clear path. Like, you have to take these courses, you got to get good grades, you got to take this test, and then you got to apply here. So everything's kind of laid out for you. There's really no guessing as to how to do it. Whereas in writing, there's so many avenues to get into the publishing business. You could go to school for that and get a bunch of degrees. You could be a teacher. You could be, you could start writing, articles in magazines or your local newspaper, or you could do none of that and you could be writing fan fiction. The avenues are just endless. And so that was why I had a lot of trouble with it, because it wasn't clear to me, like, how do you do this? Because I never had to do it before.
Yeah, that is true. There's not a clear, like you said, not a clear path. Do this, and that. It's like, it keeps changing too. The publishing world is crazy.
Oh my gosh, all the time, constantly. Yeah.
And so I think it's really cool too, because I was looking at your books. You do like a real mismatch of genres too. So it's not like, because usually when I heard, a doctor, I just assumed you're writing medical thrillers or something, but you went a whole different avenue, historical thrillers, a little bit of paranormal in there, and crime fiction. So how do you just enjoy all those different genres as a reader when you decided to mix them all up and you started writing?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of write whatever sort of just tickles my fancy at the moment. And sometimes they're really widely varying topics. And so I've written nonfiction, like history of medicine stuff. I've written historical fiction, as you said. And I think there's just like a certain kind of weird quirkiness to some of the topics that I pick. And maybe that's why I find them interesting. But it also leads me in like these huge directions. And so, I've written a novel about people on a sentient spaceship. And I thought that was really fascinating, because ultimately I think some of it comes down to things like science and biology and medicine and chemistry, pharmacology. All those things are really fascinating to me.
And was A Beautiful Poison, was that like your first into this, in this area, this type of books?
Yeah. So A Beautiful Poison was my first foray into writing historical fiction. It did sort of have a little bit of a medical background in that I had wanted to write something that featured Bellevue Hospital, which is where I did my residency, and has this huge, long history in New York City. And I was also kind of fascinated by Radium Girls, like the whole, it was this kind of horrific situation with these watch dial painters at the early part of last century that got poisoned from radium. And so I wanted a character who was dealing with that, and somebody who was fascinated by chemistry. And I threw in the influenza epidemic of 1918, and I threw in World War I, because I had a really great teacher in high school who showed me a lot of World War One poetry. So it was just like, I basically was like cram, shove. I like kind of stuff it all in there. But that was the first one. That was my first historical book.
And you probably would never thought that after writing about the 1918 pandemic that you would be dealing it in real life. Huh?
No, I really,
Crazy.
it's funny because in retrospect, it's like, of course there was going to be another pandemic in our lifetime. Like it's really obvious now when you sort of look at how things happen in cycles and stuff like that. But it was still a shock when it happened. But yeah, there's a lot of really strange parallels between what happened in 1918 and what's happening now. Cause I'm actually writing about that as we speak for a nonfiction project. So it's been pretty fascinating.
Well, that'll be interesting because I always wondered about that too. Like, I mean, were they having debates about wearing a mask back in 1918? It was just so.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. There were like I think like in San Francisco, there was a mask mandate and people were just so upset about it. And, just very up in arms about like, why are you making us do this thing? And it's like infringing on our independence. It was very similar to what's sort of going on today.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, it absolutely was. And then there were like, these large gatherings that would happen that people would warn them against, like, don't do that. But the overall, though, the 1918 epidemic, in a lot of ways, was just this really terrible confluence of factors. It was like the war. It was that particular strain of influenza, and it hit young people, which was a very odd thing that they don't fully understand why. But people between like 20 and 35 were just dying, like at much higher rates than normal flu epidemics or other pandemics happen. So it was just a very strange, very horrible virus.
Yeah, and especially 100 years ago, I remember what was the TV show? Oh, have you ever seen The Nick? I love that TV
Yeah, I
show.
watched a bit. Not all of it, but I watched parts of it.
It's, it's so crazy that when they stick their hands with no gloves and when they're operating and.
They did. There was so much stuff that happened in the history of surgery that's just like, wow, you really did that? Like, I remember there's something I was reading about, like there was a doctor, it was like somewhere around the turn of the century, who was like, there's no spitting like in the operating room. And like people were like yelling at him. They were just like, you're so ridiculous. What are you talking about? Why shouldn't we spit?
Oh my gosh.
I know. And now we can sort of look back on it and be like, it's ridiculous. But they had to fight through a lot of the social mores and the status quo back then to do, to actually develop healthcare in a more positive way to make it safer. So.
And so can you tell us about your latest book, Opium and Absinthe? Ooh, now I'm going to butcher that one. Absinthe?
You got absinthe. I know. It's I know, part of the reason why I just love absinthe is just the word is so interesting. It's like a little bit of a so this book takes place actually in 1899, and the story is about a young girl. She's 18 years old, and she's very wealthy and very privileged, and she breaks her collarbone falling off of a horse. And while she's recovering, she realizes that her sister is missing, and her sister is actually found murdered. And the manner of her murder is really, really strange. She has puncture marks in her neck, and her body's found drained of blood. And so automatically people's thoughts go to, well, must have been a vampire. And in 1899, Bram Stoker's Dracula was released in the United States. And so it had been out for several months by the time. And so there was a little bit of this, well, could it have been a vampire? How could it not, if it was, how could that be? And so the main character, Tilly, aside from going through her healing process and then actually an addiction to opium that leads from an injury, she also has to try to really suss out the truth and figure out, who killed her, and is there a vampire? And if it's not, why would it look like a vampire killing? So she has to do a lot of a kind of investigating on her own. And she's a really, really curious person, except that, of course, being a young woman at the turn of the century, she's confined by so many social restrictions. Like, she's literally confined by her corset. I mean, like physically, her dress, everything, what she's allowed to do go, when she can go out, who she can be seen with. And so under those restrictions, she has to still solve this murder.
And how much research do you have to put into that? Because you're dealing with the historical aspect of it. I imagine the readers want making sure that everything is historically accurate. So do you put a lot of research beforehand?
I do. I put a fair amount of research into it. I can't really begin to fully form the story unless I have a setting and a place, because, having the story go from A to B, you have to actually know where A and B are and if they actually existed at the time and if it was amenable to the story. And so I had to do a lot of research, one, to figure out if the main parts of my story actually made sense at that time, and then two, to make sure that the actual individual plot points would work within both New York City in 1899, and then socially and geographically and all that kind of stuff. Like, I even had to very carefully figure out the months and the weeks where these things were going to take place, because at some point in time, Nellie Bly, who's like this famous woman journalist from the late 1800s, her story is actually interwoven into the story as well. And if she's supposed to exist in that book, I had to know where she was at the time, and if it would make sense for Tilly actually writes her letters. Like, it would have to make sense that she might actually be able to receive the letters. Like, was she in Europe? Was she in the States? All that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of that work that has to go into it before I can even put any words down on the page. So from that perspective, it's quite a bit of work in the beginning, and then throughout the book, it's also very difficult. So if you're just writing a scene and somebody sort of looks down the street and they see something like a horse and carriage or a buggy or an electric car, you got to figure out did that happen? What were they called then? And did they still call them hansom cabs back then? Did they have gas lights, or were the gas lights actually petering out and they were using electric lights? But how many electric lights versus? I mean, it's just so you go one paragraph and all of a sudden you're stopped because you got to do more research to figure out how to even write the scene. So it can get kind of entrenched sometimes in the research.
And what's your writing process like? Do you outline everything, or do you sort of just kind of, once you have an idea, you start writing it, or?
So I generally start with an idea and then I build upon the idea. I just freeform, just write lots and lots of notes, just brainstorming through the concepts. And then once I feel like I have a beginning and a middle and an end, and I kind of know how the story is going to go, then I have to really do some research and make sure that the setting and the geography work, and do some more historical research with reading books and just making sure I get all that right. And then once I have that, then I start writing a more explicit outline for the book. And the outline is usually in chunks, sort of like what has to happen in the first tenth of the novel and the second tenth of the novel, and making sure that things are building up the way that they're supposed to. And I'm leading readers appropriately astray here and there. So I'm laying those sort of red herrings just so. And then once I sort of have that, then I will write. So I don't outline to the point where I know exactly what everybody's going to say in every scene. I don't go that far. I just sort of outline to the point where I'm I know what has to happen in the next 3 chapters. I just have to make that happen somehow. But so that's about as detailed as I got.
I think it's pretty cool too. I've seen that your protagonist Tilly is addicted to the opium. How would that? I mean, that's kind of interesting, and to have the protagonist addicted to that. How did that all come about? And tell us about that.
So, sorry, we have dogs barking.
Oh yeah, I have 3 little ones. I'm surprised they're a bit quiet.
Okay, yeah, no, they like to go and try to. They like to attack the bunnies in the backyard. They never can, actually. So that kind of idea came from. So one of the nonfiction books that I had written is called Quackery: A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything, and that book is a history of medicine, a nonfiction book about some of the really strange and awful kind of treatments that we used to do. And I wrote the entire chapter on opium. And so I was reading extensively on the history of opium. And I'd found out that, when morphine was discovered, and when the syringe was actually created, which was in the mid 1800s. And interestingly, one of the pieces of information I found was that a lot of the initial morphine addicts were women, young women, or like basically rich women in these cities and towns and stuff like that, because the syringe kits were these hand-blown glass and brass kits in these beautiful boxes, and you had to be wealthy to even afford one. And so it was very interesting that a lot of women who were treated for things like hysteria and, you know, other ailments that weren't necessarily real, were getting treated with morphine, and they were becoming these, what they called morphinomaniacs. And so I thought it was very interesting, given that, you know, we are in the midst of an opioid epidemic that has been going on for some time. You know, being a physician, I've had to deal with that firsthand in my practice, and it's been, you know, so it's really tough on patients. And I thought it would be kind of enlightening for people to understand that this is a very old problem, and that to maybe put aside some of their preconceived notions of what an addict looks like, or, you know, is like. You know, I start with somebody who's very naive, who's a very good-hearted person, who falls and succumbs to this really kind of dark pull of using medication as a way of healing a lot of things that can't be healed with opium. So I was really hoping to be able to do that well, and tie that into the story, so that people would realize that in some ways, you know, there's another character in that story. It's the drug. And the drug is sometimes calling the shots, and sometimes it's Tilly calling the shots. And, you know, they sort of have to figure out, are they going to come to some sort of détente and come out of this alive, or are they not? And so, so that's kind of how that happened.
And is this a standalone, or is it part of a series?
It is technically a standalone. So all of the historical books, so The Impossible Girl, A Beautiful Poison, and this one, they're all standalone, but they all have a common thread in that they all take place in New York City. They are all historical sort of medical mysteries, and the same family keeps popping up in the story. And so if you read carefully, you may have to actually take notes, but if you read carefully, you will see that the main character in The Impossible Girl is a relative of the Cutter family. And that person is a distant relation to Tilly. Tilly's would-be suitor is actually, his last name is Cutter. And the main character in A Beautiful Poison is Aline Cutter, who was a daughter of one of the characters in Opium and Absinthe, but I can't tell you who. So there is a string through there. At some point in time, I'm gonna have to draw a family tree, but I haven't put it in the books yet. But they are standalone, yeah.
And so you say you've also written nonfiction. That's interesting. That Crackery one sounds very interesting. I'm going to go look that up. I'm so with the whole thing with the pandemic now, I've seen that's coming out now too. People pushing all these, you know, silver Jim Baker, and it's like
oh my gosh, it's everywhere. And I think that's kind of very telling, that like quackery never dies. It doesn't. I mean, somewhere in the far, far future, when we're like, you know, Star Trek level of like medicine and stuff like that, like it will probably be gone then. But until then, it's always going to be around, because we don't have a cure for everything. And since we don't have a cure for everything, it's going to be there.
And what's the differences for you between writing fiction and nonfiction? Are there similarities, or do you approach them completely differently?
They're approached really, really differently. So like from even just like conceptualizing the book to trying to sell the book, it's done very differently. And, you know, the audience is very different, but the writing itself is in nonfiction, it's very regimented for me. So like I'll have a chapter on a topic that I have to write. And so I just do a bunch of research, a bunch of reading, and then I have to figure out how to put all that research and reading into like 3,000 words that are very entertaining. And so, it's difficult. It's a completely different way of thinking. And in some ways it's very gratifying, because like when you're done that chapter, you're sort of like, okay, on to a new topic. Whereas with writing a novel, it never ends. It feels like it never ends. It's just go on and on and on. So it's just different. I like them both very much. but they have different stressors when it comes to writing. So.
And did you ever, like when you're going through, when you were younger, you're going through medical school, was it always in the back of your head that you wanted to someday try to write a novel, or is that did that come later?
No, I did not know I was going to write a novel in medical school. I tried to do some writing like in college and a little bit after college, and it just didn't go anywhere. I either didn't think I was good, or I was aiming for stuff that was like too high. Like I would write a short story for a short story contest where there was one winner and like tens of thousands of entrants. Like there's no way I'm going to succeed doing something like that. And I kept thinking, for quite a long time, which is that I was only really good at science. Like I love biology, I love chemistry, and I really love medicine. And so it just seemed natural, like, well, put your eggs in the basket where they belong. Like do what you're good at. And I didn't think I was very good at writing. And so it wasn't until, again, I was like sort of several years into my medical career that I started writing essays on what it was like to practice medicine. And so that was a very easy thing for me because it was like, okay, this is what I know. And it was familiar to me, and I got a couple of things published. And so got my feet wet that way, had some successes, then had a lot of rejections after that. So I just I kind of kept going. And then little by little, I would get like a poem accepted, and another poem accepted, and another short story accepted, an essay. And then when I decided that I was going to try to write fiction and like go into writing books, I kind of knew I knew nothing about it. I didn't know how to write a book. I didn't know anything about the publishing business. And so I just gave myself a lot of sort of grace to be like, look, you don't know anything. Just take it all in, learn as much as you can. And I gave myself a very tiny amount of time to sort of find success. And I just blew through that deadline, like, whatever, bye, see ya. And I just kind of kept going because I enjoyed writing novels. It was just so much fun. I had an amazing time just sort of opening my imagination up to all these what ifs and like, ooh, what if I wrote a story about this? And what if I did a story about this? And it was just, it was a blast. So much fun. And it was oddly, a very fantastic complement to practicing medicine, because on the one hand, you have the publishing business and you have your imagination. And on the other side, you have like, helping people, saving lives, but then you have like a lot of the stressors of what it's like to practice and red tape and paperwork and all that kind of stuff. And so weirdly enough, they complemented each other, and like the stresses of one were always alleviated by like the positives of the other. And so it worked out really well.
And what are some of the authors that influenced you as a writer?
Like the authors?
Yeah, like as
authors.
a reader.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so probably one of the first authors that I think influenced me, Jennifer Donnelly, was a young adult author, and I think hers were some of the first books that I read, and they were just beautifully written and so transportive. She writes a lot of historical, and I just remember being like, wow, this is just beautiful. If I could write something like this, I'd be like so proud. So some of her writing really sort of got me entranced in like, wow, I would love to try to do something like this. Reading Twilight and the Twilight series was a huge lesson in realizing that I did not need like a degree to get a book contract. I could just try. Mm-hmm. So, and I was really into young adults at that time. That's when I started reading a ton of it. And sorry, that's my dog moaning in the background.
No worries.
It's the squirrels again. She sees the squirrel. So I found out fairly early on that like I could actually teach myself how to write, and I could.
Okay, we could cut that part out.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a good thing it's not live.
My poor husband in the background going like, "Stop working! Let's go outside."
Oh, I had to live. Believe me, especially now that we're all at home. I have 3 dogs. My wife's out there, so yeah, it's.
I know.
I know how it gets off. If the mailman comes, forget about it.
Yeah, I know. Same with us. Like the doorbell rings, and our dogs are like small.
Yeah.
And as much as I hate to admit it, they are yappy. I'm sorry, but they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. We
So.
have two Chihuahuas and a Havanese, so I know how that goes.
Oh my God. We have a Yorkie poo and a Shih poo. So man, the poodle in them, it's just, they're like super barky barky.
Yeah.
So where was I? Let's see. Oh, authors
Mhm.
that affected me. And then another person, Suzanne Collins. So again, remember, I was reading a ton of young adult at the time. Suzanne Collins, reading through the Hunger Games series really was a huge lesson in economy of prose. Like, there is not a single sentence in her books that is extraneous and unnecessary. And so a lot of young writers, I think, tend to overwrite things. They'll say things 2 or 3 times to get their point across, or they'll describe something to the point where you're like, okay, like the tablecloth is red already. I get it, you know? So a lot of the things that I learned, I think I learned from reading other books. But I would say those were just a small handful in the young adult world that sort of had an effect on me in the beginning when I was writing pretty much nothing but young adult. So, but I mean, I have a lot of favorite authors, and I will most likely forget like thousands and thousands of them. But I tend to read and reread a lot. I'm like a serial rereader, and some of the books that I love from when I was a kid, like Jane Eyre, you know, it's not so much. It's not always the entire book. Sometimes there's just a single scene or a feeling that I'm trying to replicate in my stories. Like if I can just capture the feeling of having to run away and be a survivor, like that is one of my favorite things about that book. And it's a theme that I will come back to sometimes. Like it's a theme that I went to in The November Girl when, my main character Hector is running away and trying to go to Isle Royal to like survive in this like horrible winter. There are a lot of these themes that I picked up from these books that I've loved like all my life about, that I've like sort of either, I don't want to say I stole them, but like, I guess I kind of stole them, that I liked putting in my books. So Pride and Prejudice, another favorite. My first book, Control, is a science fiction novel, and the characters are all loosely based on the Pride and Prejudice characters. Because I mean, sometimes when you have 2 love interests that like kind of hate each other in the beginning, there's nothing like that kind of tension. It's just fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, I could talk on and on and on about this, but there's countless. These are just the ones off the top of my head that I can think of, but there's so many others.
Well, Pride and Prejudice is so amazing. Not only does it inspire a lot of writers, but there's like a whole subgenre that I discovered about that, like with zombies, or they're writing a lot
Mm-hmm.
different about different characters in that world, and it's fascinating
It
how
is. I
influential
mean,
that is.
I think it's very telling that some of these books that sort of like re-enter your lives, or they show up in pop culture all the time, is because they have these sort of universal truths. And I'm not going to say, that every man is in want of a wife, but they have these universal truths that really is what all trying to expose these truths within people, between people, in society, in so many different ways. And so I think that's what we are all sort of trying to get to when we're writing a book, is finding that little kernel of revelation that you've read millions of times in all the different books that you've read, but like you want to try to do that your own way, in a way that makes people go, oh my gosh, look at what just happened. So, and it's so much fun to do that.
So what's next for you and for your fiction writing?
Okay, so next for me in fiction writing is I'm going to be writing a fourth historical novel. This one is going to take place in World War II, and it's also going to be in New York, and it's also going to have a relative of the Cutter family in it. But this one is going to take place in the Brooklyn Navy shipyards, as well as dabble in the Manhattan Project a little bit. So that one's still being written. It'll probably come out, I think, spring of 2022. So in a couple of years.
Okay. And Opium and Absinthe, that's out right now, so people can go check that out. And where can people find you? I would look at your website. You have got a lot of great information in there, so it's probably the best place to
Yeah.
find you.
So my website, lydiakang.com. I'm on Instagram a lot, so you can find me on Instagram at Lydia Kang, and on Twitter is Lydia Y Kang. But come follow me on Instagram. You can sort of get inside my mind and see all the different things that I'm sort of looking at and observing and cooking, because I cook a lot too. I'm always hungry. I put food in every single one of my books because food is like it's like basically the most memorable thing, and almost everything I read sometimes are the food scenes. So gotta have scenes in there. Anyway, yeah. So come find me online. Say hi.
Yeah, right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Lydia, for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it. It was real nice talking to you about your books.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.